October 6, 1553. A military camp near Ereğli, in the heart of Anatolia. Inside a silk tent embroidered with gold thread sits a man who, within minutes, will be strangled by his own father's bodyguards. He is 38 years old, the empire's most capable general, adored by the Janissaries. Mothers in distant provinces name their newborn sons after him. He was supposed to become the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Instead of a throne, a silk bowstring was waiting for him. The order came from his own father. This is the story of Mustafa, eldest son of Suleiman the Magnificent, a man history seemed to be grooming for power, and of a woman whose name still divides historians between admiration and horror. Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. Before we go further, here's what makes this story genuinely contested rather than settled. Was Hurrem a calculating figure who cleared a path to the throne for her own children? Or was she a woman trapped in a system where a single misstep meant death, not just her own, but her son's? Historians still argue this, and by the end of this video, you'll have enough evidence to form your own view. Today, we're unpacking one of the darkest episodes of the Ottoman Golden Age, separating the documented history from the legend that Western drama, and later, Turkish television built around it. Part 2. Two factions at court. To understand what happened inside that tent near Ereğli, we need to go back 30 years, to 1515, the year Mustafa was born. His mother was Mahidevran Sultan, a Circassian concubine. Some sources place her origins in Crimea, others in the North Caucasus. She was the first woman to give the young Prince Suleiman a son. Under the customs of the Ottoman court at the time, that made Mustafa the natural heir, the eldest son, whose mother held the coveted status of Haseki, the Sultan's chief favorite. Mustafa grew up at court as something close to a model prince. Unlike many Ottoman princes whose lives were confined to palace intrigue, he gained genuine administrative experience from a young age. Following the centuries-old Ottoman sanjak system, under which princes were sent to govern provinces to gain real statecraft before claiming the throne, Mustafa administered first Manisa, then Amasya. And by every account, he was excellent at it. Venetian ambassadors, whose dispatches remain one of the richest sources we have on the inner workings of the Ottoman court, consistently described Mustafa as intelligent, educated, and fair. He spoke several languages. He personally involved himself in provincial affairs. Soldiers respected him not for his title, but because he shared the hardships of campaign with them instead of staying behind in his tent. For the army, traditionally the decisive political force in the Ottoman Empire, Mustafa embodied exactly what a future sultan should look like. A warrior, not a court operator. But this seemingly perfect heir had one serious rival. And that rival wasn't a rebellious province or a foreign enemy. It was a woman at the very heart of the palace, inside the harem of Topkapi. Her name was Hurrem. The story of how she arrived at court is wrapped in nearly as much legend as the execution of Mustafa itself. The most widely accepted account holds that she was born the daughter of an Orthodox priest in what is now Western Ukraine, captured in a Crimean Tatar raid, sold into slavery, and eventually brought to the Istanbul harem, where she caught the attention of the young Sultan Suleiman, not primarily for her beauty, but for her sharp wit, musical talent, and an infectious joy for life. That's where her name comes from. Hurrem, the joyful one, the one who laughs. What happened next had no precedent in Ottoman history. Suleiman didn't just make Hurrem his favorite, he married her. To modern ears, that might sound like a formality. In the 16th century, it was a political earthquake. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had avoided formal marriages, keeping concubines in a legal status below that of a wife. A deliberate choice designed to prevent a wife's relatives from gaining influence at court. Suleiman broke that unwritten rule for Hurrem, and he went further still. Ottoman tradition held to a principle known as one mother, one son. Each concubine was permitted to bear the sultan only one heir, specifically to prevent any single woman from consolidating too much power. Hurrem bore Suleiman 6 children, 5 sons, Mehmed, Abdullah, who died in infancy, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, and 1 daughter, Mihrama. Stop and consider what that meant in practice. Suleiman no longer had 1 concubine with 1 rival son to Mustafa. He now had an entire faction, a legally recognized wife with 4 surviving sons, each one a potential claimant to the throne. Topkapi Palace split into two invisible but entirely real camps. Part 3. The Logic of Fear. To understand what actually drove Hurrem in the years that followed, you need to understand one brutal, foundational law of the Ottoman system of succession, a law introduced by Mehmed the Conqueror and formally written into his legal code. The law stated this: whichever son ascended the throne had the right, effectively, the obligation, to execute his brothers. The wording was nearly literal. The elimination of a new sultan's brothers was justified for the order of the world. This wasn't an exception or an emergency measure. It was the norm, a mechanism designed to prevent the civil wars that were otherwise inevitable in a system where, formally, every son of the sultan had an equal claim to power. The empire had already seen this law carried out at its most horrifying. When Mehmed III took the throne at the end of the 16th century, he ordered 19 of his brothers strangled in a single day. Now put yourself in Hurrem's position. She has 4 sons, either grown or approaching adulthood. There is also Mustafa, older, experienced, beloved by the army, who by every unwritten rule stands first in line for the throne. If Mustafa becomes sultan, he won't merely have the right to kill Hurrem's 4 sons. He'll have the obligation to do it in the name of the order of the world. That single fact reframes everything that follows. You can read Hurrem's subsequent actions as the cold calculation of an ambitious woman clearing a path to power for her children. But you can just as legitimately read them as a mother's desperate fight for the literal survival of her 4 sons in a system where their lives were quite genuinely on the line. The truth almost certainly sits somewhere between those two readings, and that ambiguity is exactly why historians have found Hurrem so compelling for nearly 500 years. Part 4. Mustafa as a threat. The years passed. Suleiman aged. Mustafa, meanwhile, only grew stronger as a statesman and a commander, and with every year, he became a more formidable figure in the eyes of the army, the nobility, and the public. There's another structural feature of Ottoman politics that made this father-son conflict almost inevitable. Ottoman dynastic history had already seen more than one case of a popular, ambitious heir who didn't wait for his father's natural death, who raised rebellion instead to seize the throne early. Suleiman himself had ascended peacefully, but his own father, Selim the Grim, had taken power exactly this way, eliminating his brothers in a bloody succession struggle, then deposing, and by some accounts, poisoning his own father, Bayezid II. Suleiman knew his family's history intimately, and the more popular Mustafa became among the Janissaries, that famously unruly military caste that had repeatedly shaped and reshaped the fate of Ottoman sultans, the more his aging father's fear grew. This wasn't paranoia without basis. The Janissaries really were, increasingly openly, expressing loyalty to Mustafa as the true warrior, implicitly contrasting him with an aging Suleiman who had grown more distant from military campaigns. By the early 1550s, tensions reached a breaking point. The Safavid Empire of Persia, the Ottomans' longtime geopolitical rival, was locked in a long, grinding war with the Sultan. And it was within that very war that the plot which would cost Mustafa his life first emerged. Part 5. Rüstem Pasha's Intrigue. The key figure in this unfolding drama was a man named Rüstem Pasha, the Grand Vizier, effectively the second most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan himself. Rüstem Pasha was married to Mihrima, Hurrem's only daughter. That made him a direct and personally invested ally of the entire Hurrem faction at court. The rise of any of his wife's half-brothers meant a direct threat to his own position. It was Rüstem Pasha who, while leading the Persian campaign in 1553, sent Suleiman a report that would change the course of history. According to the dispatch, dangerous rumors were spreading among the soldiers that Mustafa was secretly negotiating with the Persian Shah, Tahmasp, on a joint conspiracy against his own father. The accusation was about as serious as it gets: treason and a conspiracy to assassinate the Sultan. How much truth there was to these accusations is a question historians still can't answer with certainty. Some researchers believe the report was fabricated, in whole or in part, by Rüstem Pasha himself, acting in the interests of Hurrem and her sons. Others point out that Mustafa likely did harbor genuine frustration with his father's policies, and that rumors of his popularity with the troops may well have handed the vizier a convenient way to reframe that popularity as an active coup in progress, regardless of whether Mustafa was actually planning anything at all. Either way, the report hit its target. It landed on ground already prepared by years of accumulating fear. Suleiman's own awareness of what had happened to his father and grandfather. Suleiman made his decision. Summon his son to the military camp. Part 6. Hurrem's role. What the sources actually say. Before we get to the outcome of this story, it's worth being honest about the question popular culture most often gets wrong. What was Hurrem's actual documented role in Mustafa's downfall? Here's an important historical caveat. There is no direct documentary evidence that Hurrem personally orchestrated the smear campaign against Mustafa. Historians haven't found a single letter, a single court document, bearing her direct instructions on the matter, which, to be fair, isn't surprising. Intrigue of this kind doesn't leave a paper trail by definition, and harem correspondence from this period has almost entirely been lost to history. What historians do have is circumstantial evidence. First, Venetian diplomatic reports from the period, and the Venetians were probably the most attentive, well-informed observers of Ottoman court life at the time, describe Hurrem's serious influence over Suleiman's decisions in general, naming her as one of the most powerful women of her era anywhere in Europe or the Middle East. Second, the direct family and political connection between Hurrem and Rüstem Pasha, the architect of the smear campaign, is undeniable. It ran through her daughter Mihrima. The vizier's stake in removing Mustafa was direct and obvious, and his personal loyalty to his wife's family is well documented. Third, and this is perhaps the most telling point, immediately after Mustafa's execution, Hurrem's sons were left as the only realistic claimants to the throne. The practical outcome of the tragedy points squarely to who benefited from it. So the historical truth most likely sits between two extremes. Hurrem probably didn't issue any direct orders herself, and may not even have been fully aware of the details of Rustem Pasha's scheme. But over many years, she built and sustained an atmosphere of suspicion toward Mustafa at court, used her considerable personal influence over her husband, and perhaps most tellingly, never once tried to intervene on her stepson's behalf or soften his fate. That's a notable contrast to her own later fight to save her son Bayezid. The legend of the scheming poisoner Roxolana, coldly plotting Mustafa's death with her own hands, is most likely a literary exaggeration, one that first took shape in 17th and 18th century Western European theater and painting, where the image of the cunning foreign woman at an Eastern court was both popular and politically convenient. Modern Turkish television dramas have only amplified and reproduced that dramatized image many times over, cementing it in the popular imagination, regardless of its historical accuracy. Part 7. The Summons to the Tent. On October 6, 1553, the Ottoman army was camped near the city of Ereğli in Anatolia, en route on its Persian campaign. Suleiman sent his son a formal summons to appear before him in his tent. Officially, the pretext sounded almost conciliatory, a chance to address the accusations, an opportunity for Mustafa to clear his name before his father and the assembled army. Many of Mustafa's advisors warned him of the danger. Historical accounts suggest that his mother, Mahidevran, and his closest counselors begged him not to enter his father's tent without armed guards, or not to answer the summons at all. But in practice, Mustafa had no real choice. Refusing a direct summons from the Sultan, his own father, would have amounted to a public confession of guilt, effectively an open declaration of military rebellion against the legitimate ruler. And for a man whose entire reputation rested on the image of a loyal, courageous soldier, that single act would have destroyed the very foundation of his legitimacy. Mustafa decided to go. According to eyewitness accounts of the events, including those of a European observer present in the camp, whose notes historians have cited repeatedly ever since, Mustafa entered his father's tent calmly, with dignity, projecting confidence in his own innocence and in a peaceful outcome. He had no idea the executioners were already waiting inside. Part 8. The Execution. Under Ottoman court protocol, the executioners tasked with carrying out death sentences against members of the royal family were traditionally mute, men who were deaf and mute from birth, or deliberately selected because they could neither hear nor speak. The reasoning was twofold. They couldn't reveal what they'd done, and just as importantly from a political standpoint, they couldn't be swayed by a victim's dying pleas for mercy. The moment Mustafa stepped into the tent, Several of these mute executioners emerged from behind an inner curtain. According to eyewitnesses, Mustafa fought back fiercely. He was an experienced warrior in the prime of his life, and the struggle went on for some time. One widely cited historical account holds that Suleiman himself was nearby, just behind a thin partition of the tent, personally watching the scene unfold, and, in another version, that he gave a direct order or gesture to hurry the execution along when the struggle dragged on too long. In the end, the executioners strangled Mustafa with a bowstring, the traditional bloodless method used in Ottoman court practice to kill members of the ruling family without formally shedding royal blood. Suleiman the Magnificent's eldest son, the presumptive 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was 38 years old. Mustafa's body was displayed outside the tent, in full view of the army. Historians disagree on why. Some see it as a deliberate act of intimidation, an unmistakable signal to any would-be conspirator or rival about the price of defiance. Others see it as a necessity, proof for a shaken and furious army that this wasn't rumor but an accomplished fact, and that further resistance or mutiny would serve no purpose. Part 9. The Aftermath, the Janissary Revolt. The army's reaction was exactly what Suleiman appears to have feared most. News of Mustafa's death detonated in the camp. The Janissaries, an elite, privileged corps who for decades had seen in Mustafa the living image of the ideal future ruler, openly grieved and openly raged. According to contemporary accounts, for 3 days straight, not a single soldier in the camp touched food prepared under the Sultan's orders, a visible act of mourning and silent protest. There was a genuine, immediate risk of full-scale mutiny, one that could have cost Suleiman not just his throne, but his life. To defuse the situation and redirect the army's mounting fury away from himself, Suleiman reached for a solution that's practically a playbook move for absolute monarchs. Name a public scapegoat who isn't you. That scapegoat was Rüstem Pasha. The Grand Vizier was publicly stripped of his post and removed from court, officially for having misled the Sultan with false accusations against an innocent son. On the surface, it looked like an act of restored justice. But there's a crucial detail popular retellings of this story tend to leave out. Just 2 years later, in 1555, Rustem Pasha was fully reinstated as Grand Vizier and held the post until his death. He never faced any real judicial consequence or any serious punishment of any kind. For many historians, that single fact is one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence that the real force behind the plot against Mustafa and its real primary beneficiary wasn't so much Rustem Pasha acting on his own initiative, but someone far more powerful standing behind him. Someone with enough authority to guarantee her son-in-law's complete impunity and full reinstatement. Part 10. The Price of the Throne. Removing Mustafa did clear the path to the throne for Hurrem's sons, but history, as it so often does when it isn't following a tidy script, delivered an outcome far removed from whatever Hurrem was presumably hoping for. By the time Suleiman died, only 2 of Hurrem's 4 sons were still alive, Selim and Bayezid. Mehmed had died of smallpox back in 1543, years before Mustafa's execution. Jihangir, by contemporary accounts, was so devastated by the death of his half-brother Mustafa, to whom he was genuinely close, that he died only a few months after the tragedy at Ereğli, reportedly of an illness sharply worsened by grief. Between the 2 surviving brothers, Selim and Bayezid, a genuine, bloody civil war for the throne broke out, the exact fratricidal conflict the succession system had, ironically, been designed to prevent. Selim eventually defeated his brother's forces. Bayezid fled beyond the empire's borders, taking refuge with the Ottomans' longtime enemy, the Persian Shah. Even that didn't save him. At Suleiman's direct diplomatic demand, the Persians handed the fugitive prince over, along with his own young sons. All of them, including Hurrem's grandchildren, were executed. Hurrem didn't live to see this final, darkest chapter. She died in 1558, several years before her son's civil war reached its bloody conclusion. The throne ultimately passed to Selim II, a ruler remembered by the rather blunt nickname Selim the Sot, or the Drunkard. Unlike his father, his grandfather, or his executed half-brother Mustafa, Selim almost never took part in military campaigns himself, showed little talent for statecraft, and by near-unanimous agreement of contemporary observers and later historians alike, became one of the least capable and least respected rulers in the dynasty's centuries-long history. Many modern historians agree on this much. Selim II's reign is widely treated as the informal starting point of the Ottoman Empire's centuries-long decline, an empire that, just one generation earlier, under his own father, had stood at the absolute peak of its power, influence, and territorial reach. Mustafa, by most assessments, would likely have become one of the strongest rulers in the dynasty's history, capable, popular with the army, and crucially, already possessing real governing experience long before he would have taken the throne. Was the threat Hurrem eliminated ever a real one, or a carefully constructed illusion, born of years of fear and a targeted court conspiracy? Did Hurrem's relentless, years-long struggle actually save her sons' lives, or simply delay, by a few years, an equally tragic and equally inevitable end? And most importantly, did the outcome of that fateful power struggle actually change the fate of the Ottoman Empire, trading, perhaps, one of the strongest potential rulers in its history for one of the weakest? History almost certainly will never give us a definitive answer. But one thing can be said with near certainty. What happened that autumn day in 1553, inside a tent near Ereğli, permanently altered the trajectory of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known.